Hey class, in this video we are going to learn how to add items that we can collect into our Godot game. We will set up the project as usual using the developer default folder. There's some stuff in there that you might not have from the previous lesson, so you might need to add the metrics scene and scripts, or you can just download the new developer default and put the stuff that you're working on in there. So either way is fine. If you're confused about that, let me know and we can go over it. Once you get that set up, we're gonna add items. So there's some pre-built item scenes that you can put into the scene. If you want to collaborate with another artist on this one, you could use their art to add into your items. Once you get the items in there, we are going to add a script that will handle the different items. So we're going to call that script the Item Manager. And that is going to detect when the player gets to the item, and it's going to update the Scene Manager to update the UI and the global values. After we set that up, we'll do some documentation, and there's a bonus for this one as well. If you want to think about another type of item that would be useful in your game and add that in, you don't necessarily have to add the functionality, but if you can just add the graphics and then add extra values to your global script to keep track of that item as well. If you have questions about how to do that, we could go over it, but that's just a little bonus thing that you could add if you're thinking about adding other items into your game. So you could think about like a key to a door maybe, and you could see if you collect that key, then you can open the door. Obviously, we haven't gotten to the point where we can add the rest of that functionality, but you can at least add in the graphics. For the items in the demo, I'm just going over like a basic item that you just kind of collect. It's like coins or points. I'm using apples as the graphics. And then there's also a life that if you lose a life, you can add a life back. So it's pretty straightforward. There's a few new concepts that we're going to cover in here and reinforce some of the concepts from the previous lab. And we're going to add a little bit to our scene manager as well. So let's get started. So to get started, you can use a game that you're working on or the developer default folder. There may be some updates, so you might need to grab those. You may need to get the metrics scene and the scripts related to metrics. So metrics manager and metric count and metric toggle. We're not going to be going over those scripts. We're just going to be using that as part of the demonstration. So you can just download the developer default and just work on the lab from there. Or if you want to put it in the project that you're already working on, just grab those scripts and that scene and bring them into the project that you already have. So either way is fine. If you're not sure what to do, we could discuss the best way to go about it. Once you're ready, just open up the project.godot. And you can check real quick to make sure that you've got everything you need. So just open up the default simple scene. And there's some stuff in here that is there from the last lab. If you don't have it, go back and look at the last lab. We're going to be using the scene manager script that we added last time as well. So we'll be starting from there. We can add the metric scene into the UI, and that's going to show our item count and the number of lives. And if you want to check if that's set up right, just click on the scene button and take a look and make sure that all of the scripts are there. If you're missing some scripts, then just re-download the developer default folder and add those in there. So let's get started adding our items. We want to have a container node for all of the items. So we're going to add a new node 2D to the default simple scene and just name that items. And then right click on there and link a child instance. And we're just going to use this pre-built item scene that is in the developer default. So there's a few things in here. The item is an area 2D. It's like a collider, but things will just pass through it. And so we can detect whether the player is overlapping with the area. So our player character has a kinematic body, and that has a capsule collider in it. And the Godot physics is always looking at all the colliders to determine whether they're touching or overlapping or about to intersect. So that happens in the physics process. Our item just has an area. So if they're overlapping, or really just as soon as they're about to touch, like right as they start to overlap, then we will get an event, which is a body enters another body. We can take a look at that event in the nodes of our colliders. So as soon as these two overlap, that's when we will get that event. And you can see that signal there is going to tell our code when that event happens. And then we can use the code to decide what we want to do once we detect that event. Now, if we bring the art back, we can see that the collider is a little bit smaller than the art, that collision shape 2D. And that's because we want the player to actually overlap a little bit with the art before we trigger that event. You can play around with what looks best in your game, but what we don't want is for it to seem like the player is not touching the art when the event occurs, because we want to show the player collecting the apple. So let's go ahead and add the script to our item. So we can stay in the item scene to do this. And we just go down to our script and click the empty and create a new one. And we want to make sure this is in the scripts folder as usual. And let's call this item manager. We could just call it item, but we already have an item scene. Just so to make things simpler, let's give this a different name. So we'll call it item manager. And we can actually use this script. We're going to design it in a way that we can use it for any type of item. It's not just going to be the apple. And what we'll do at the beginning is give each item a type. So later when the player collects an item, we can use the type so that the scene manager can tell what type of item is collected, and then we can decide what to do based on that type. So our default type is going to be an apple. And so we'll say export var item type equals apple. And that's a string. So it's basically just like a label that we can then test later to check, is this an apple or is it a life or is it something else that we might add? And we're going to use the export keyword again so that we can change the type in the editor so that a designer or somebody else working on the project could easily change the type without changing the code. The next thing we want to add is a signal for when the item is collected. And so when the player overlaps with the item, we will change the animation and do some other stuff, but we also want to send a signal to the scene manager. So the scene manager can update the global variables and update the metrics and do the other things that we need to do to represent that change of state that the player has collected another item. We also need a variable to track whether or not the item has been collected. So we'll call this variable item is collected, and we'll set this false to begin. And this will help us know if the item is collected. That way we can prevent doing something like collecting the item twice. We'll see why we need to do that, because when we collect an item, it's not just going to disappear immediately. We want to play a little animation first, but then we do want to remove the item from the scene. So in order to not be able to collect the item twice during that brief period when the item collected animation is playing, we can just set that variable to true. So we can just flip that variable, and then that way it won't happen again. So this is a quick thing that we need to do to make sure that we can play this animation, but not still be overlapping with the item. So it'll just be a few frames, but since we know the player is already going to be overlapping with the item, we know that it'll get triggered again. And this is a pattern that you'll see a lot with these types of collisions. So now the main part of our code is when we detect the player entering the item area. And we can use a signal to do this. And so we can actually just disconnect the signal and reconnect it, and we can see how that works. So I just double click on the event that we want, which is the body entered, and that body is going to be the player. And you can see we've created these in the past by just writing in the function that we want. But if we just choose the function that's generated by Godot, it'll just put the function directly into our code. So that's kind of convenient. We don't have to do it that way, but this one makes sense on item body entered. That's what we're looking for. So we'll just leave that as is. And we get a variable with that, which is the body. And that could be useful if we want to do something to the player, but we're not going to be doing that. We're going to be talking to the scene manager instead. And so we're just going to put a little underscore before body. That's basically just telling Godot that we're actually not going to be using this body argument. But for the function to work, we do have to have some argument there so Godot won't get confused. So inside that function, the first thing we want to do is detect if the item is collected. So we say if not item is collected, which is the default state. So the item has not been collected. So if it's not, then we are going to collect the item. So the first thing we do is set item is collected to true so that we can't collect it again. And then we are going to play the collected animation. So we say $animated sprite as usual to reference our animated sprite. And we say .play, and then we have the collected string to choose the collected animation. Another thing that we want to do, this is probably something that might not be noticeable, but we want to make sure that animation starts from the beginning. And the way that Godot is set up, when I'm toggling between these animations, sometimes you could set it to the wrong frame. And so just to make sure that we don't make that mistake, let's just set the frame to 0. Again, that way we know it'll play from the beginning. We don't have to worry about how it's set up in the scene. So that'll play the animation, and then we can also emit our signal. So we can say emit signal, and then the signal we're doing is item collected, and this signal, unlike the last lab we did, actually has an argument. And so we can just add our item type as the next argument after item collected. And so that's a way that we can tell the scene manager what type of item was collected. So this is the first argument that we've added ourselves, and this is a good way to basically change the way that this signal works. Not only are we collecting an item, but we can also specify which type of item is collected. This means that we don't have to write a new signal for every different type of item in the game, so we can save time writing our code to work for different items. We also have a sound in there. If you don't see a sound or you haven't added the sound, don't worry about that, but you can do that in the first sound lab. And if you do see a sound in there, if you're using the default assets, let's just do $collected sound.play, and that will play our sound effect for when the item is collected. So that's everything that happens when the player enters the item and we send the signal. You might have noticed that we haven't removed the item from the scene. And that's because we still want to play this animation. If we just take the item out of the scene immediately, we won't see that collected animation. And what we can do to make sure that the item does leave is we can use another event in our nodes called animation finished. And so we can just click on this and connect it directly to our script again, and see it generates this function on animated sprite animation finished. And so we can use that to know that the collected animation is done. We only want this to happen if the item has been collected. So we don't want this to be triggered by the default item animation. And so in order to do that, what we need to say is if item collected. So that way we know the item has been collected. And then we use a function called queueFree. And that's a built-in Godot function that removes whatever object the script is attached to from the scene. So we can use that to remove the item from the scene as soon as the animation is done. And so that's everything that we need for our script. So let's go back to our scene view and test that out. So let's go back to our scene view and edit the scene a bit. So when I added the item, it just added it right in the middle of the scene. Let's move it over away from the player so it won't just get triggered immediately. And I'm going to turn the grid and the snapping on just to make it a little bit easier to move it around and keep it within the grid. And let's change the snap to 32 by 32 so we have something that matches the art. And so I'm just going to move that over and let's go see if we can collect it. And that looks good. So the animation played. I'm not recording the sound, but that worked as well. But we didn't update the metrics. So that's the next part that we have to do for this lab, is we have to update our scene manager script to change the metrics. The metrics has a bunch of code that will update what happens in there. We'll go over that code in a later lab, but for now, let's just leave it alone. So we have to get a reference to our metrics, just like we have to our game over and our player. So let's go into the scene manager script and add a new export node path and call it variable metrics path. And then we can use the same on ready variable metrics equals get node metrics path. So we can load a reference to our metrics node in our scene manager, and we'll just tell the metrics to update the displays when this event occurs. So now we're going to use the signal from the item. We have that item collected signal that we created, and we're going to attach that to the scene manager. I'm going to change this method to make it more simple. So I'm going to call it on item collected. So that way it's not specific just to our item scene. It can be used for any other item that we might add in here. And then we have to actually add in the item type argument that we sent with the signal because that's something that we created. So now that we're in our scene manager, once we collect an item, the first thing we want to do is test the item type. So we're going to use a conditional here. We're going to say if item type and then double equals and then the string apple. And the double equals sign here is a little bit different than the equal sign that we've used in the past. So when we use a single equal sign, we're assigning a value back to a variable. So we're saying lives equals 3, but what we're really saying is there's a variable called lives and its value is 3, but that value could change later in the program. When we're using two equals, what we're asking is this variable the same as this value? So item type has the value apple, and we want to test if item type, if that value is the same as apple, then we want to do something with our code. So the double equal sign is going to evaluate that and then either tell you, yes, it's true, or no, it's false. And so if it is true, we just want to update our global item count. So we have the item count here. This is just a generic term for this item that happens to be an apple. So you could add more item counts, or you could change this name to be more specific. But we're going to grab that item count and we're just going to add 1 to it. So that will show the player that they have 1 apple. And then we can continue to update that value as they collect apples throughout the game. After that, we just say metrics.updateDisplay. And so this is a function that's just going to look at all of the different metrics in that UI and update how they look based on the global values. And so again, as I mentioned, we are going to go into that code in a later lab. But for now, let's just use the code that's in there and just see if it works. So now we can collect the apple and we see that 0 changes to a 1. So now we've got an item that we can collect, and we can also keep track of how many of them we have. So let's add another one into the scene. So I just duplicated that by hitting Command D. And the nice thing about duplicating an item that already exists is that everything else that's built into that item, like our signal and our script, all of that other stuff, also gets duplicated. So we don't have to repeat any of the process that we just did to make that item work. So now I can just collect a whole row of apples, and I can add them anywhere I want to in my scene. So this is just for demonstration purposes. Obviously, you would want your rewards or your items to lead to, some other part of your level, or kind of have your character have to make decisions about, do I want to collect more items or do I want to avoid danger? Stuff that we'll talk about in the level design lecture and also in the level design lab in the designer section. So that's something that you might want to check out once you've done these labs over here. So we have one more item that we already have built in the default folder, which is the life. So the player has a number of lives. We can see they're represented by the 3 hearts in the metrics. And so we can add in our pre-built life scene. And the nice thing here, we can add this script. So we'll choose the life node, and it's set up exactly the same way as the apple. You can see there's an area 2D, an animated sprite, our collision shape, and a collected sound. So it's all the same stuff. And it works basically the same, but when we collect it, we're going to check what type of item it is, and then it's going to have a different effect on the game. It's going to give us back a life if we lost one. So we don't actually have to do anything else. We just have to attach the script. So let's click on that script and grab the item manager script that we just wrote. And all we have to do is then edit the value in the script variables to change from item type apple to item type life. And then we'll update our code to deal with the different item once that event occurs. So that's one of the nice things about writing code, is that if we have things in our scene or in our game that act similarly, rather than having to write 2 different scripts for our apple and our item, we just have to say, what is the difference between the apple and the item, and how do we capture that? And there's a very simple way to capture it. We can just give it a different type. And then in our scene manager, when we're deciding what to do once we collect these things, we can test the type and then make choices based on which type it is. So let's connect our life to our scene manager using the same signal, the item collected signal, and make sure that we use the onItemCollected function so that it matches. And if we get that right, it'll connect to the function and we'll see that that is set up correctly. And so if you don't see that, then you might need to type it in again. Maybe there's a typo or something like that, but that should work. And so we already test for the apple. So next, let's test for the life. So we can say if item type is life. If it is, we can increase the player lives by 1, just like we did with the apple. But the one thing we want to change is that we don't want the player to be able to get infinite lives. We only have 3 hearts up there to represent how many lives the player has. And you can change that if you want to go into the metrics and give the player 2 lives or 4 lives. That is something that you can change. If you want something in the game later to increase the total number of lives the player has, you could also try something like that. But for now, we're just going to stick with that 3. So we have to test if the item is a life, but we also want to test if the player already has 3 lives. We don't want to add another one. So after item type equals life, we'll say, and global.playerLives is less than global.total lives. So that will make sure that the number of player lives is less than the total lives. So if the player lives is 2, then we can go from 2 to 3. But if the player lives is already 3, then nothing will happen. So we can say global.playerLives equals global.playerLives plus 1 to add 1 to the number of lives. And so we don't actually have any obstacles in our scene yet that will take away the player lives. We're going to add those in a couple labs. But for now, let's just change the starting number of lives to 2 so that we can collect that life just to see that it works. So one more detail that I want to look at real quick, but we'll discuss more in depth in the obstacles lab, is our layers and masks. If you click on the life, you'll see under this collision panel, there's 2 little grids that have little dots on them. And this is our layer and our mask. The layer is what layer this item is on. And then the mask is what other things or other layers it can interact with. So this is a bit confusing at first, but we'll cover this in a couple labs. So one thing that we do to optimize games, which means to change the code to make sure that they run fast enough that they work and look good to the player, is we don't want to be testing all of the objects in the scene against all of the other objects to see if they're overlapping or standing on each other or other physics things could be happening, because that takes up a lot of computer processing power. So we can simplify that by putting certain things on certain layers and only testing some things against others. So for example, our player is on the first layer because a lot of things are going to interact with the player. We need our platforms, we need our items, we need our obstacles. All of those things are going to interact with the player. But for example, our item is not going to interact with our platforms, at least not this item, because it's just floating in the air. If we wanted to, we could add a kinematic body to the item and have it fall and, tumble around in the scene. But for this demo, we're just leaving the item sitting there. And so we don't actually have to test whether the item is interacting with platforms or obstacles or other things in the game that aren't the player. So one way we can do that is to put the item on a separate layer and then only put the player in the item's mask. So that's why you see in the layer grid, the third square is highlighted. That's the layer that the item is on. And in the mask grid, the first square is highlighted. And that's the layer that the player is on. So you can see, we can show that if I turn off the player mask for the item, the player will just walk straight through the item and won't collect it anymore. So this is a good way to kind of organize different things in our scene. And it makes it so that we can write simpler code. So we don't always have to test to make sure, is the thing that just ran into this item the player? Because we know that Godot is only going to detect interactions between the player and the item. So it makes the game run better and it makes our code easier to write. And it just takes a little bit of organizational work. So this is a very quick overview of how layers and masks work. Depending on which one of the scenes you're using, you may see that your layers and masks are already filled out if you're using a scene that I created. But if you're using your own scene, the layers and masks may not be filled out. I wouldn't worry about that too much. I'm going to go into a lot more depth when we talk about this with our obstacles. All right, so that was everything I wanted to cover in this lab. Hopefully you can see that there's a lot of different things that we can do with items. Anything that you want to collect and keep track of in the game could be an item scene and could be added into the code in this way. So let's just take a quick screenshot of our scene that we have to add for some documentation. And then we can go over to the Open Lab and create a new post. And we can add in the category. And we have a lot of categories now, so you might want to search for it. So you can do that just by typing in the name of the lab that you worked on, and the category should come up. If it doesn't come up, you can actually just add it, but you can also let me know and I'll add it. Anyway, let's just call this collecting items. So for our description, if you added in like a bonus thing, definitely talk about that. Or if you just have ideas for what you might be able to do with items in the future, you could talk about that as well. So I'm just going to say a quick sentence about adding in the item manager script, and then let's throw in our screenshot and we can preview that real quick, and that looks good. And so let's go ahead and publish.